Well, ladies and gentlemen, hello again. Welcome to another Reflected Reality Simulations video. My name's Graham, this is Explain 11, and part 4 of the video series looking at the Felis 747-200. In this video, we're going to take a look at the fuel tank configuration and making sure the aircraft is set up correctly to keep the fuel where it's supposed to be for our transatlantic crossing. We are 200 miles away from 30 West. We're still on the first set of waypoints we loaded. So waypoint 9 is 30 West, we loaded that at Heathrow. But in the intervening period between the previous video and this one, I have loaded waypoints 1 through 7 of the next set of waypoints. So 1 through 7 is now behind us, the original 1 through 7 we don't need anymore. 8 to 9 we're still using, so I've reloaded 1 through 7 with these waypoints here. And that takes us on towards the Great Lakes and well down into America. So one set of waypoint reloads takes us as far as North America from the UK without any issues. And this is a fairly realistic routing. 2 hours and 20 minutes since we left the stand at Heathrow, and looking at the fuel tank configuration, we can see that the centre wing tank, the pumps are on, but it's got the low pressure warning. Now I've left this a little bit longer than really I should have done. The pressure lights are on, and when those pressure lights come on, we should switch the fuel pumps off on the centre tank. I've left it a little bit longer to demonstrate that even if you do nothing, the aircraft will still continue to operate as expected. What you have now is the number 2 main and the number 3 main through their 4 boost pumps feeding fuel into the crossfield manifold, which is feeding engines 1 and 4, as well as the normal feed to engines 2 and 3. So it's only the number 2 and the number 3 fuel that's being used at the moment. The objective is to burn number 2 and number 3 down until they are more or less equal to the number 1 plus the reserve. So looking at that there, it's going to be what, 15.1, maybe about 16 tons in total. So this configuration now will be satisfactory until we burn down to 16 tons in each of the 2 tanks, the number 2 and the number 3 tanks. That's about 40 tons of fuel to go. That's maybe another 3 hours of flying. So fundamentally, with 5 hours of flying, we haven't had to do anything other than just turn 2 fuel pumps off. Everything else was done at flight level 100 on the climb out. You'll notice that there's some fuel left in the centre tank at 1.2 tons. That might be important later, so what I want to do is to get that fuel out of the system into one of the main tanks. So we've got this scavenge pump here. If I switch the scavenge pump on, that is going to slowly extract the fuel from the centre wing tank and put it down into the number 2 main tank. That is going to cause a little bit of an imbalance. We'll address that in another few moments once the tank's empty. That's pretty much it. Let's skip ahead a little bit. Well, hopefully just a few moments for you, but for me it's been about 1 hour and 35 minutes. But finally the pressure warning light on the fuel tank scavenge pump has come on. So I'll switch the fuel pump or the scavenge pump off now, and that is almost all of the fuel from the centre tank transferred into the number 2 main tank. Progress of the flight, well, we're about here when we started the scavenging process, and now we're coasting down towards Canada. So all we have to do now is to rectify that fuel imbalance, because as I said, we've got slightly more in here, almost just about a ton more in the number 2 than the number 3. At the moment I've got 4 engines running off 4 fuel pumps. So you might think it would be acceptable simply to close this crossfeed here, and as a result the number 3 tank would only feed the number 3 engine, and the number 2 tank would feed the other 3 engines. But that's not really ideal, that's not a particularly sensible way of doing it. Instead what we're going to do is use the Jettison system, which sounds a lot more scary, but in actual fact all it's going to do is to transfer the fuel, or put the fuel onto the transfer manifold at a higher pressure. Because just like these centre tank pumps are override jet pumps, it's the same with the real jettison pumps here. So the engineers would do this from a procedure sheet or from the QRH, but we want to make doubly sure that the nozzles, the jettison nozzles, are closed. If those nozzles are closed, then the fuel is not going to go overboard. From then we're going to work top to bottom on the panel here. The heavier tank is the number 2 tank, and the number 3 system is the lighter side. The mains and the number 1 main, number 4 main and the reserves are both still evenly matched. So we'll put the number 1 jettison pumps on, inboard and outboard, and then on the second line here, the jettison valves, right centre wing, we're going to open that, and I'm going to start a timer. So what that's doing is it's taking fuel from this tank here and supplying it onto one of the transfer manifolds at a higher pressure, higher than the boost pump pressure, and as a result, only this tank is depleting. Now, should there be an issue with the transfer system, we haven't turned any of these pumps off, so the system will still happily take over again, should we need it to. I'm running the timer because I want to make sure I'm not transferring for too long, so the timer reminds me I'm doing something. On the fuel flow gauges here, we can see that we're burning 3.1, 6.2, so what's that? 12.4 tonnes of fuel an hour. So let's say 12 tonnes an hour, that's about 1 tonne of fuel in approximately 5 minutes. So to consume this tonne of fuel down, or this 700 kilos, is only going to take 3 or 4 minutes. Once that's complete, we'll switch off the jettison transfer pumps, the jettison transfer valve, and the jettison pumps, and then we'll be back to balanced operation. While it's doing that, we can see we're still at flight level 310. Let's have a look at the flight plan. We're routing towards waypoint 2 at the moment. Waypoint 3 is hoist, which is the end of the oceanic section. We're preparing to do some further DME updates, but we're not quite at range just yet. And hopefully when we get back inside the area where we're positively radar controlled, we'll be able to get a climb done up to our cruising altitude, our higher cruise altitude here. If we look at the maps, obviously we're just coming into the Canadian radar area at the moment, procedural control area perhaps. We are now 300 tonnes, just under 300 tonnes. So looking on sheet here, we're doing 0.85, and if I look at this, 310 tonnes, that lets me up to 3.3, and 296 will be up to 3.4. So 3.4 is probably the altitude we go up to next. Going back into the normal semicircular rule airspace. Just a case of waiting for that fuel transfer to finish. Let's skip ahead a little bit further. So back in the action now, we can see that we are just a few kilos to go, 26,210, 26,190, 200, 190. I'll close the valve, that stops the flow. I'll switch the pumps off, double check all the fuel pressures are sensible, and we close the jettison valves. And now we can see we've got a fuel system that is almost perfectly balanced. Really, you only need to balance it if there's 500 kilos difference. All we have to do now is continue the flight and burn down number 2 and number 3 main tanks until they are essentially number 2 is the same as 1 plus the reserve. So just as a reminder, that's going to be 14.4 plus 1.7. So that's going to be 16.1. We'll get 16.1 in the number 2 main. We're going to put these pumps on and revert to what we call tank to engine feed. That means number 1 feeds number 1 engine, number 2 tank feeds number 2 engine, and so on and so forth. So that's not too bad for another change at 4 hours into the flight. And to be honest, the scavenge, you don't need to do that straight away, you can leave that for a little bit longer. So again, if you're flying away from keyboard, you can schedule these fuel changes in as required. Or fast forward time. Okay, so here we are, back again, well into northern Canada now, routing down towards the Great Lakes. Looking at the flight engineer panel, we're down to 16.4 in both tanks. For another 300 kilos out of each tank, and then we'll go tank to engine configuration. It's been 5 hours and 40 minutes since we left the stand at Heathrow, so maybe another 4 or so hours to go to our destination. I hope the fuel system is making sense so far. It's actually really very straightforward once you get used to it. We've not made any significant changes to the fuel system since we left Heathrow. We could have left those centre tank pumps on and nothing bad would have happened to the aircraft. So you've basically got about 6 hours of flying before you have to do much at all with the fuel system. By going tank to engine, what we're going to do is switch on the number 1 main and the number 4 main pumps, and then we're going to slowly close the cross-feed valves here. We're going to leave one of the valves open, and the reason we do that is so that there's still pressure in the cross-feed manifold here. We don't want that to be zero pressure, we don't want fuel to be trapped there. So by leaving one of the cross-feed valves open, it allows us to maintain pressure. The objective in this whole exercise is to keep the fuel as far outboard on the wings as possible. That just helps minimise the stresses on the airframe by carrying the weight out in the wings, where the wings are generating the lifting force, as well as the weight. It makes the thing a little bit more efficient. Technically it reduces the amount of wing structure required to carry all that weight, which seems counterintuitive. So just another 100 or so kilos to go. It doesn't have to be precise, really. We're looking for within 100 to 150 kilos, that should be fine. As I said previously, if you're going to balance the fuel, you need to be looking at a 500 kilo imbalance before you really worry about it. So very nearly there. What we're going to do is I'm going to put the number 1 main fuel pumps on, the number 4 main fuel pumps on, and then I'm going to work back across. I'm going to close the number 4 crossfeed. I'm going to make sure we maintain fuel pressure. Close number 3, close number 2, and that should be as set. You'll see the number 1 main continues, is starting to feed fuel now, as is the number 4 main. We've got just about 16.1 in both of those tanks, the number 2 and the number 3. So if we take the number 1 main figure and we add on the reserves, then that will give us the same as number 2. So it's all set up to take us all the way until top of descent. So from flight level 100 until top of descent, we've had to make one change in the fuel crossfeed settings here, the fuel crossfeed controls. Let's have a quick recap of that, and then we'll cover the rest of it in the descent video. So this is the fuel system on the 747-200, and I've tried to draw it in a similar style to the ICAS display on more modern aircraft. I've got these bars at the bottom representing the levels in the fuel tanks, the triangles represent fuel pumps, and the crossfeed valves are represented by these circles here. As you're fueling the aircraft, it's important to make sure the fuel goes into the reserve tanks. So you make sure that the reserve tanks valves are closed before you start fueling. That way you get fuel in the reserve tank, as well as the outboard main tanks, the number 1 and 4 tanks, and the inboard tanks. And if you add the reserve fuel to the main outboard tanks, you should get the same value as the inboard tanks. So you keep filling it up. You can see at this point the 1 reserve plus 1 is equal to the number 2. So basically you could run this aircraft tank to engine and all the engines would get the same amount of fuel. They'd all run out of fuel at the same amount of time. As you keep fueling it up, the inboard tanks, the 2 and 3 tanks, get full, and then you start putting fuel in this center tank. And this is roughly the configuration we had when we left Heathrow. So all 5 sets of pumps were on. Obviously, in the aircraft, there's 2 pumps represented by each of these triangles, but you've got the number 1, the number 2, the center tank, the number 3, and the number 4 tank pumps all switched on. We've also got the number 1 crossfeed and the number 4 crossfeed. You can see the center tank arrow here is a little bit bigger. That implies that it's producing or providing fuel at a higher pressure. In this configuration here, the center tank fuel would be supplied outboard here to the number 1 engine, and because the center tank delivery is at a higher pressure than the main tank delivery, it would use the center tank in preference. And that's the same on both sides. Now, if we were taking off with a relatively small amount of fuel in the center tank, less than 4.5 tons, less than 4,500 kilograms, you'd run the takeoff with the center tank pump off. The pump's off on the center tank means that if that fuel sloshes around, you don't get any fuel pressure variations. You can see that the crossfeed manifold is still pressurized. That's because those crossfeed valves are still open, so the number 1 pumps are pressurizing the manifold, as are the number 4 pumps. But this is back to our config. This is how we took off with fuel in all of the tanks and all of the pumps on. So we took off and we climbed away and we got to flight level 100, at which point we'd burned some of the center tank, but also some of the number 2 and number 3 tank fuel. To stop us using any more of that fuel, we opened up the number 2 and the number 3 crossfeed. So you can see now that center tank fuel is provided with a higher pressure also to engine 2, as well as engine number 1 and engine number 4. You might be wondering why we switched off tank pumps 1 and 4, because obviously the center tank's at a higher pressure, so switching these pumps off seems a bit unnecessary. Well, it's actually fairly straightforward, because what's going to happen now is the center tank is going to drain down. And you're going to get to the point where the center tank gets to the minimum supplyable amount of fuel, and then the pressure drops off and it stops providing fuel. So look, all the crossfeeds are open and the 2 and 3 pumps are switched on. Once the center tank runs out of fuel it can deliver at pressure, this crossfeed configuration means that the number 2 tank and the number 3 tank feed all 4 engines. So that's why we switched off those fuel pumps, those outboard fuel pumps, when we got to flight level 100 on the climb out. This little bit of fuel in the center tank is not ideal, so we've got that little scavenge pump, and it moves the fuel very slowly from the center tank to the number 2 tank. And it's one of very few actual transfer pumps on the 747. Most of the pumps you've got are feed pumps, but these the scavenge pump is really a transfer pump in that it transfers the fuel directly from one tank to the other. It doesn't feed it to the engine. Unfortunately, what's going to happen is you'll end up with a slightly higher amount of fuel in number 2 than in number 3, and that's where we use those big scary Jettison pumps. Now, this isn't a representation of the plumbing of the Jettison system. You've got the left side Jettison pumps and the Jettison transfer valve here. This is just an overview basically of what's happening with that excess fuel. It's being provided from tank 2 into the right hand side of the fuel system at higher pressure. That means this fuel, this excess fuel, will be used in priority to all the other fuel in the system. It feeds into number 3 and number 4, and it also feeds across the manifold into 1 and 2. So that will quickly sort out that fuel imbalance, and then you're back to having the same amount of fuel in tank 2 as you have in tank 3. And you continue to drain the tanks down. So it's only pumps 2 and 3 that are on at this point. Eventually you'll get down to the point where you have the same amount of fuel in tank 2 as you have in 1 reserve plus 1. You can see the vertical position of that line is the same. And all you're going to do now is turn on pumps 1 and 4, and then you can close the cross feeds. It's important to get that order correct. You've got to make sure those pumps are on before you close those cross feeds. And this is where you've got tank to engine now. So 1 is feeding 1, 2 is feeding 2, and so on and so forth. You might be wondering why this valve is open. Well, that's simply to keep the fuel rail, the transfer or the manifold, the crossfeed manifold, pressurized. So you don't want the fuel to be locked away in there. If you were to close this valve as well, you would have fuel stuck in that line, and with the temperature changes and that sort of thing, you get very undesirable effects. So basically that is allowing the crossfeed manifold to behave as part of the fuel system. It doesn't have to be number 1, it can be number 4 as well. So now the tanks 1, 2, 3 and 4, they should all drain at roughly the same rate. They drain evenly. And when you've got enough space, you can transfer the reserve fuel into the number 1 and into the number 4 tanks. So if you've got less than 2,300 kilograms, or you get to top of descent, then you open the reserve valves and the fuel feeds down into the main tanks, and now you've got the same amount of fuel in all 4 tanks, which is basically what you want for the rest of the flight. So I hope that makes the fuel system a little bit clearer to understand. It's a very straightforward system once you've used it once or twice, and if you stick to what I've shown you here, you shouldn't have any issues with managing the fuel on those long range trips. In the next video, we'll look at the final descent into Phoenix, the approach and landing, and shutdown. I hope you'll join me for that. Thanks very much.